Hello everyone and welcome back to Flashback Fridays. Now I'm conscious I spent a good amount of time in my Flashback Friday slot just focusing on Star Wars, but I had a pretty huge collection as a kid and they bring back such warm, fuzzy memories. So I'm going to stick with the theme, but this week I'm going to be looking back at one of the jewels in the crown of the Power of the Force 2 line from Kenner in the early 90s, and that of course is the Millennium Falcon with electronic lights and sounds. Now, as I'm sure most of you will already know, Kenner's Power of the Force line from the early 1990s was an attempt to reinvigorate and revamp their earlier successes with the 1980s action figure line. Except that these new figures would have brand new sculpt, new likenesses, new accessories, new paint apps, and a few new characters and vehicles to join them. This would end up being one of the most expansive lines ever produced and introduce Star Wars toys to a whole new generation. And I was one of those kids who was getting to play in the Star Wars universe for the first time in the 1990s. And of course, Kenner reissued the Millennium Falcon that had been so popular in the 1980s line. But at this time, it would have a few significant updates. So, let's take a look at this packaging. First off, this is a massive box. This is a huge vehicle, so this is a nice big oblong box that we have here, and it looks very bright and very colourful, and just seeing this again after all these years was very exciting. It does my heart very good to see this. I love this packaging. It's actually, in hindsight, quite simple by today's standards, but there's something magnificently magical about this when I was a kid. I love how this branding really worked. I love that red lightsaber blade in the background. I love seeing Darth Vader's helmet there in the top left-hand corner, the Star Wars logo, and then up front and centre we have this fantastic image of the Millennium Falcon toy itself, and of course they've enhanced it a little bit by showing off those laser beams that it doesn't actually fire, but it does indicate that it is electronic because they do light up. If we flip it and look at the reverse, it shows off some of the action features. There's an awful lot of small print that we can see on here. Not too much more added really, except we can see what's inside the vehicle as well, which is pretty cool. Some interesting shots there. And then finally at the very bottom right hand corner we see some of the other vehicles that are available as part of this line, and I've covered some of these already on my channel. There's no two ways about this. This is a beast of a vehicle. This is one big chunk of plastic that we have in our hands. It is all mostly one piece as well. There's a couple of little extra bits and pieces, like the satellite dish is a separate piece that's removable, and there's a couple of other little bits and pieces like the top of the cockpit and the back of the cargo area as well, but we'll take a look at that a little bit later. But I think what's really impressive about this is the fact that the transfers have still stayed on after all these years. I'm amazed they've really stood the test of time because they're still super sticky and they still look fantastic, and they add so much colour and vibrancy to this vehicle. And whilst they seem to have kept the base mould from the 1980s line, I feel like this is slightly scaled up, and there's certainly some improvements on this vehicle in terms of the shading and how they're drawing out some of that fantastic sculpting so we get the most out of this. In the top centre, we have the laser cannon. Now, in the film, there's one on top and on the bottom as well, but on the toy, we just have the top one here, and it looks pretty cool. Again, pretty faithful to what we see on screen, very nicely sculpted. Not a lot when it comes to shading this time around. It is just a base plastic mould, but this looks pretty good. Although, I do have to caution you to be very careful with this because, of course, it could easily snap off, so you have to be very careful with this, and it is linked to another feature, which we'll come back to a little bit later. As I mentioned, the satellite dish is a separate piece, but you can see it is sort of articulated in the sense that you can move it up and down to face different directions, and of course you can also rotate it all the way around as well. So this is pretty cool. Once again, not really an awful lot when it comes to shading. It is just a base plastic mould, but it looks really good and it's pretty nicely done. One of the distinctive differences with this version of the model is the fact that it has a lot more transfers, making it more colourful and bright and more authentic to what we see on screen, but it also has a lot more shading and paint apps on the actual vehicle itself, a lot more darker grey areas to make it look more lived in and more battered and more realistic. You'll notice that the top of the cockpit is produced in a different colour plastic to the rest of the vehicle. This in some ways is a visual cue to the fact that you can actually lift this up, and you can either remove this completely or leave it sort of hinged on its side. Inside, you'll notice that the seats this time around are black rather than blue with the original release, and of course we have a lot more coloured stickers here, making this look really colourful, and again, adding a lot more detail and texture than is actually really there. I'm surprised by how effective these stickers are, and the cockpit can seat 2 figures quite comfortably. Now, it all depends on which figure you're going to use for this, because some of these figures tend to have quite broad legs, and they might be a bit difficult. I'm thinking of Lando from Return of the Jedi, for example, but most of the Han Solos will fit in here fairly easily. You can get Chewbacca in here, or in this case, Princess Leia, and they fit pretty snugly for the most part. So as long as they don't have those big wide legs, you should be alright. And of course, you can close the lid on that and they can sit in there quite comfortably, and you can just about see them through the plastic glass as well, which is pretty fun. Now, it wouldn't be much of a playset if you couldn't open this up and use some action features. And if you remove the top plate of the back of the vehicle, we can see inside the interior of the Millennium Falcon. They've been very, very clever with how they've constructed this quite relatively small space, but actually made you feel like you've got access to pretty much the whole of the ship that we see in the films. And this is mostly achieved through those transfers, those stickers again. Inside we can see the interior, and I love these stickers. We've got hallways going off one direction, we've got all sorts of computer banks, and this just looks really colourful. And actually there's not an awful lot going on in this space, but if you think about it, it's created this sense of depth and texture from literally just a sticker, and it's really very effective. It also adds a lot more colour and interest as well. So I think they've done a tremendous job with this, and it looks really, really good. I really like that they have the holographic chess game as a separate piece in here, and you can see the characters around this. I think that's quite fun, and there's enough space here to get a few different characters in this space. You get Chewbacca in quite comfortably with maybe C-3PO if you really wanted to. And actually, although I was saying it's quite a confined space, it's deceptively large in other ways, because you could actually use this as a storage container to hold quite a lot of different figures. As you can see, this very comfortably houses Han Solo in his carbonite block, and you can actually fill this up with quite a few different characters before it starts to feel overcrowded and cramped. But that's not all, because there are a few fun action features as well. You'll notice there is that central gunner chair there. You can sit a figure in here quite comfortably, and if you rotate the plasma cannon at the top of the vehicle, you'll feel the ratchet work and you'll definitely hear it. You'll also spot that hidden compartment as well, which handily just lifts up nice and easily, and you can store some extra figures in here as well if you want them to hide out, or you maybe want to store some dead bodies. But once again, I think it's worth noting that we actually have some transfers in here as well, making even this compartment look quite colourful and fun. But that's not all, because the Falcon can also stand freely as well. There is a front leg and 2 back legs as well that you can push down and lock into place, which allows the Falcon to stand independently. But wait, there's more, because there's also the interior ramp, which you can let down from inside with those 2 supports there, and allows your figures to enter or exit the vehicle. And I have to say, this is a pretty cool, if unexpected, feature. I really like that they bothered to think about this and the internal logics of how it works. Now, in terms of scaling, I'm not sure whether the figures are really going to ever really use that ramp unless you're using Yoda, because they're going to be slightly too tall. As we can see here, these figures are probably a head too tall for this ramp. But nevertheless, you can see the scaling obviously is going to be a little bit out here, but they scale quite nicely in the sense that this vehicle still feels absolutely humongous when put next to your action figures. So you can have quite a few figures lined up here to make up the length of this vehicle, and it's still going to look pretty massive. And yes, I've saved the best to last, because I did say that this is electronic. This is definitely an innovation of the 90s. This wasn't present in the 80s at all. This takes 2 of those very big, very fat batteries to power. And I will note that this compartment is a bit of a nightmare to get open. You're going to have to be very careful with it, because there is a danger that you could snap off some of the plastic, but it's very frustrating because it is very, very wedged in there. So do be careful when you're opening this, and be patient. But the results are definitely worth it. You have 4 buttons producing 4 different sound effects. And there you have it, undoubtedly the jewel in the crown of any kid's collection of the Power of the Force line in the 1990s, and even before that in the 1980s. It was a pretty excellent vehicle even then. This is an iconic ship, and the fact that Ken have done such a fantastic job of recreating that vehicle, not just on the outside but on the inside as well, making this very playable, making it very fun, all these fantastic features, and making the most of this space and this vehicle. And I have to say, the improvements in the 1990s version, having all these stickers, transfers, sound effects and this extra shading, really makes it for me. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos soon.